practice together. And so I've been a bit busy, so I didn't really get far through his work, because I'm also not a politics student, so I don't really understand much of it. So I was just wondering if you could expand. It says he identified some basis factors for analysis that are important to Weber, and it was the political theoretical line of the resistance, the question of praxis, and the question of organisation and leadership, which provides the first two factors with the necessary dialectical connection, and what that means.
So you do want me to talk until next Monday? So look, Gaston Canifani was. So what do you study?
Chemistry.
Chemistry. Okay. He wasn't a chemist, but he was a novelist. In his studies English or English literature, he wrote some fantastic short stories. He was a poet. He was an artist. So if you know any of you might have seen the poster, which is the poster of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is a picture of Palestine and then it has a black arrow on it. That was designed by Gaston Canifani. So he was a fine artist, he was a novelist, he was a short story writer, he was a poet, he was a political theorist, and he was a historian. And he pulled those things together to talk about various things. Now, his own history, he started off as an Arab nationalist, and then in 1967 he joined the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine was a self-defined Marxist organisation. What that probably meant is, in the terms of 1960s, would be that they would have more similarities with sort of Mao and maybe the Vietnamese liberation movements, and some of the what we might call the third world liberation movements would be what would be at the heart of their project. But as I said, for him, the key thing was that the Palestinian, ordinary Palestinians, the Palestinian people, not only had the enemy of Western imperialism, they clearly also had the enemy of Zionism, but the third was always the Arab ruling classes. The state of, and if you look at that more recently, look at the way in which when the Iranians launched their pre-planned and informed to the Americans attack a few weeks ago, where were those aircraft that shot them down came from? So some were from Israel, some were from America, also from Jordan, and also from Egypt. If we think about the role that Egypt has played in terms of the Egyptian state, it's not a heroic role. Although if we go back to the 1950s, you know, the sort of strength of Arab nationalism was in Egypt and Syria, at those places. So he was very critical of the role of the Arab states, of the Arab leaders, of the Arab ruling classes, and basically said that people in Palestine had to liberate themselves, and it was ordinary Palestinians, workers, peasants. For him, those that were prepared to take up the gun and the various guerrilla organisations that were there at that time. Perhaps just to give a little bit of context, perhaps it's worth thinking about the various different strategic orientations that the Palestinian movement has tended to take. So I said that first of all, the Nakba, the Palestinian leadership had been decimated by the events of 36 to 39. So if you imagine yourself being a refugee, fleeing to Lebanon, or fleeing to Egypt, or fleeing to Jordan, or fleeing to Syria, you don't have your own leadership. The most attractive option at that time was Pan-Arabism. And the notion, it was coined by the Arab national movement, that the liberation of Palestine will come through Beirut, Cairo and Amman. In other words, that it would be the Arab leaders, or the Arab countries, the Arab people that would liberate Palestine itself. That was very strong in the 1950s, it was very strong in the 1960s. It kind of crashes in 1967, because in 1967 there is what's called the 6-Day War, and Israel basically defeats Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan in the 6-Day War. So why would you want to put all your eggs, if you like, in the basket of those strong Arab leaders when they've just lost that war? There's a really interesting battle which takes place in a place called Karama, which is in the Jordan Valley, but on the Jordan side of the river. And it takes place also in 1967. And the Israelis had just beaten Egypt, and they'd taken the Sinai and all the rest of it. They had just taken Jordan and thrown those out of the West Bank. They had taking on Syria and taking the Golan Heights, which they still maintain today, they were supremely confident, and they looked round, and in Karama, in this small village in the Jordan side of the Jordan Valley, there were a small number of Palestinian guerrilla fighters. And they lined up their tanks, they got their parachutists, and they were quite clear that they were coming for Karama. And in Karama there were two main organisations. There was Fatah. So Fatah was the organisation that was set up in the 1950s. I've just done a really older person's moment and I can't remember.
Sure.
Arafat, imagine forgetting Arafat's name. Can't believe it.
Yes, Arafat.
So Fatah was set up by Arafat in the 1950s, and he was in the village of Karama, and the other main organisation was the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And the Jordanian armed forces come to the village and they tell the guerrillas, you have to flee. The Israelis are coming for you, you have to go now. And I don't know if it's apocryphal, but the story goes that Arafat gave his greatest ever speech, and he basically said, this far and no further. The Palestinians have ran for so long, for too long, we will not run, and we will not turn round, we will not take one step back. If we die here, we die here, but we will not take another step back, and we will not flee from the Israelis. And so Fatah stay in the village. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine go up into the hills. The Jordanians then decide that they will provide hard military cover, and the Israelis come. The Israelis have never lost a war against the Palestinians, and they are taking on a small number of guerrilla fighters. But in the village of Karama, at the Battle of Karama, Israel loses and the guerrillas win. And in the days after that, thousands, literally tens of thousands of young men and women in the refugee camps across the Arab world sign up to join the Fedayeen, the fighters in the PFLP and Fatah and the various other organisations. Fatah becomes the most important and the largest of those organisations. But it moves, if you like, from Pan-Arabism, our liberation will come through the Arab states, they've defeated. Now, through Karama, our liberation will come through us taking up the arms and fighting for our own liberation ourselves. And that's the sort of dominant strategy then, from the rest of the 60s through the 1970s. And it more or less comes to an end in 1982. 1982 is important for me. I was at university, that shows how old I am, but I was at university, at Glasgow University, and in 1982 the Israelis launch a war into Lebanon, and in Beirut, that's where the majority of the Palestinian forces are, and there's a 62-day siege of Beirut. They bomb it from the sea, from the air, they send in troops, and the fighters hold off the might of the Israeli forces. And interestingly, there's a picture that's beamed around the world of a Palestinian child who's been killed, like we see today. And the horrible right-wing American President Ronald Reagan picked up the phone to the Prime Minister of Israel and said, this must stop. It's interesting the power that America has if they want to do it. And what happened was that there was then negotiation, and a man called Philip Habibi was sent over by the Americans to get a negotiation in Beirut. And there was debates within the Palestinians about what they should do. But Yasser Arafat agrees, which is that the Palestinian fighters will go on ships and leave Beirut. And if they leave Beirut, the Americans promise that nothing will happen to the refugees who are left behind. And what happens is that the Palestinians get on ships and they are scattered across the Arab world to Algeria and various other places. And when they leave Beirut, the Israelis, 2 days later, put flares up into the air, and they let the fascist Falange organisations of the Lebanon go into 2 refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila, and there is the most horrific slaughter of the refugees, the defenceless refugees of Sabra and Shatila, and they are abandoned and they are slaughtered, and it's the most horrific thing that happens. It's important for me because that happened in 1982 during the summer, and when we went back to university, Glasgow University became the first university in Britain at that time to twin with Birzeit University in the West Bank. Interestingly, when we did that in 1982, we were seen to be so far off the scale because nobody supports Palestine, we were seen to be extreme, etc, etc. So it's interesting to just think how things have changed. We're now the majority. We were absolutely the minority in 1982, but we are now the majority in that way. Of course, what that meant was that also brought an end to the notion that the guerrillas will be there to protect us. They didn't protect the people. in Beirut, and actually the Palestinian question then moved off the agenda. Even the Arab League stopped leading off its annual conferences with Palestine question. It moved to the bottom of the agenda. It actually was the Palestinians of Palestine 48 who brought Palestine back onto the agenda in the First Intifada. The First Intifada is an absolutely heroic uprising by the Palestinian people. They went on strike, they went on marches, they closed down their shops, they fought with stones against the might of the Israeli armed forces, and they kept it going from 87 right the way through into the early 1980s. And it was the Intifada, it was the First Intifada which brought the Israelis to the table and led them to pursue the Oslo Accords. Now, of course, the Oslo Accords were not good, it's led to us down that road, but nevertheless the Israelis were forced to negotiate because of the popular uprising of ordinary people inside Palestine 48 itself. So the notion of self-liberation became about mass movements rather than armed gangs, or armed guerrilla forces, which was what had taken on before. So we went from Arab leaders to the guerrillas to the popular mobilisations. The popular mobilisations after Oslo were then put down, and then we had the Second Intifada. But the Second Intifada of the early 21st century was different from the First Intifada. The First Intifada brought young and old, men and women, gay and straight, Muslim and Christian, people of no faith together in a mass movement, kind of what we are seeing around the world today. The Second Intifada was an armed uprising. And if you think about having an armed uprising, you don't involve everybody, you have to be very secretive. So you have your group of 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 people in your immediate organisation. You don't want it anymore because the Israelis will try to infiltrate, so you're very secretive and you try to organise those in that way. So this isn't about mass mobilisation, it was about the actions of a small minority on behalf of the masses in the Second Intifada. And the Second Intifada was brutally put down by the Israelis in a gunfight. My own view is that we will struggle to beat Israel in a straight gunfight, but where we have the power in mass mobilisation, in strikes and protests and those kind of demonstrations, we have the power to beat not only Israel but the rest of the imperial forces. And the real power in the Middle East rests with the massive working class in the Middle East region, in places like Egypt and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. There is massive working class organisations, and in those working class organisations in those parts of the world, Palestine is key. Palestine is key. It's a key mobiliser. Of course they fight over wages, and of course they fight for political rights, but the role of imperialism and how it's frankly fucked the Middle East over the years is absolutely a central part of everyday life for everybody, from Egypt through Syria, through Palestine, through Iraq, through Lebanon. Think about the last 25 years. You probably don't because you weren't even born at the turn of the century, but if you think about this century, think about how we have fucked up the Middle East. Look what we have done in that part of the world. Sorry, excuse my language. So if you think about what we have done to mess that region up over the last 25 years, the devastation that we have caused, of course you might have said, well, there were some dictators in place, but they still nevertheless had hospitals and schools and roads and all those things. Now in Iraq and Syria, they have none of those things. What benefit have we had? So British imperialism, American imperialism, Western imperialism, and of course if you are from the masses in the Middle East, the Arab working classes, your hostility towards Western imperialism is part of your everyday breath that you take in terms of the politics of it. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah.
It's a long answer.
I mean,